Welcome everyone to this morning's seminar. We're very excited to be able to host this seminar for you all. I wanted to do some quick introductions, but before we begin, to kick us off, I'd like to turn it over to Bishop Marvin Harada to lead us in opening Gasho.
Okay, if we were Gasho, I'd just like to thank Rick for being our speaker today. I've heard him speak on his civil rights involvement when he was young. I never tire of listening to him. I'm looking very much forward to today. Join me in Gasho. Namu double two. Namu double two. Namu double two. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Reverend Harada. So good morning, everyone. My name is Brandon Yanari, and I'm one of the co-chairs of TechnoBuddha. And Sydney, did you want to go ahead and introduce yourself as well?
Sure, yeah. My name is Sydney, and I'm the other co-chair for the TechnoBuddha conference.
Great. As I mentioned before, we would like to welcome everyone to this seminar that's hosted by CBE and TechnoBuddha, which is titled Good Trouble. We're very lucky to have our guest speaker, Rick Stambul, here to help host this as well. And before we begin, I just wanted to talk a little bit about TechnoBuddha and what that is for folks. After that, we'll go ahead and introduce Rick and start with the presentation. So we're excited to have you all here virtually. You know, we're going to host a TechnoBuddha conference in March 2020, but unfortunately due to COVID-19, that didn't happen. You know, we're very grateful that we've had Rick Stambul here he was supposed to be our keynote speaker for TechnoBuddha, and you know, he's graciously agreed to host the seminar so that we're still able to hear the you know, about his experience and the wisdoms that he can bring to all of us. Just a little bit about the TechnoBuddha group and the TechnoBuddha conference. The TechnoBuddha conference is hosted by the Center for Buddhist Education at the Jodo Shinshu Center, typically for folks between the ages of 21 to 39. And it's to provide an opportunity for young professionals to network and find a sense of community through workshops and activities that incorporate Jodo Shinshu teachings in everyday life. It began in 2007, and the TechnoBuddha name derives from the original co-chairs wanting to focus on how their generation's experience with technology might affect the experiences with Jodo Shinshu Buddhism. And ever since then, the name has stuck. As I mentioned, March 2020 would have been our 13th annual TechnoBuddha conference with the theme Vision 2020. We really wanted to address how our ideals are formed by Jodo Shinshu Buddhist teachings amid various social issues and current events. However, due to the pandemic, we're unable to host the conference as previously planned. So fortunately, our keynote speaker, Rick, that we had booked to present at the March TechnoBuddha conference was very open to the idea of collaborating to host this virtual seminar. We're grateful to continue working with Rick and keep up the discussion on these topics. Before we go ahead and introduce Rick, I wanted to mention as well that if you have any questions or want any clarification on TechnoBuddha, CBE, or anything that Rick is presenting, please utilize the chat function. We're going to keep folks muted just to minimize distractions, but I will be monitoring the chat function in Zoom. And if you have any questions during the presentation, we'll record those. And when we get to the question and response section, then at that time, we'll be asking the questions. So even if we don't get to you, we will eventually get to you at the end. So just make sure to use that function there. At this time, I'd like to pass it over to Sydney to introduce our speaker.
Okay. Hello, thank you, Brandon. So I'm going to give an introduction to Richard Stambul. Richard Stambul has been a member of the West Los Angeles Buddhist Temple since 1985 and served the Buddhist Churches of America as its national president during the past 2 years. He was a foot soldier in the civil rights movement, attended the March on Washington, and was a student volunteer in Mississippi for Freedom Summer. He served on the NAACP Civil Rights Council. He is presently a member of the Board of Trustees of the graduate school, the Institute of Buddhist Studies in Berkeley, California. Rick practiced law for 41 years in Los Angeles, New York, and Washington, D.C. He graduated from UCLA with a degree in history and from Loyola University Law School, where he received a teaching fellowship and taught for several years. He authored the first law review article in the United States about police brutality targeting the Black community. He has appeared before the U.S. Supreme Court. He worked as a civil rights lawyer, providing pro bono legal representation to those in need. In the 1980s, Rick interviewed scores of Japanese Americans who were unconstitutionally imprisoned during World War II. He has talked about his involvement as a foot soldier in the civil rights movement and the incarceration of Japanese Americans throughout the United States. Rick lives in the greater Los Angeles area with his wife, Robin Steinhardt, and their cat, Sheba. Without further ado, please welcome Rick Stambul.
Thank you, Sydney. Good morning. Good morning to everyone. My name is Rick Stambul, and I am honored to welcome all of you to today's meeting. Thank you for making the time to join us today. I'm grateful for the invitation from TechnoBuddha to speak with you about the racism that we confront in America today. My perspective is both limited and informed by my own prejudice, my own experience as a foot soldier in the civil rights movement, and my career as an attorney with a focus on social justice. My thanks to Reverend Marvin Harada for leading us in Gasho this morning, and to TechnoBuddha's co-chairs and today's moderators, Sydney Shirayama and Brandon Yanari. My thanks to BCA's Center for Buddhist Education, known as CBE, for assisting, and to CBE and Judy Kono for the many wonderful and well-attended Buddhist education programs it has sponsored. My thanks this morning to Koichi Mizushima for his time and technical support today with the videos that we'll be showing during my presentation. Brandon already explained what TechnoBuddha is. I would only add that TechnoBuddha is engaged for the people of ages 21 to 39. This morning's meeting, as he said, is open to all of those of any age, I should say all of us of any age, wishing to join us. TechnoBuddha and CBE are affiliated with the Buddhist Churches of America, the oldest and largest affiliation of Buddhist temples and sanghas in North America. I'm proud to be a member, and again, I welcome you all today. The title of my talk today, Good Trouble, is my way of honoring the memory of civil rights icon John Lewis, whom I am proud to have known. Good trouble is the kind of trouble you can be proud of, a term used by John Lewis to mean standing up to authority for what you believe in, or as he often said, standing up to the man. During the next hour, I will try to raise questions about the racism we face in America today. Where did it come from? When did it begin? What does it look like? And how does it feel? First, John Lewis. I first met John Lewis on August 28, 1963, in Washington, D.C., the day of the March on Washington. The early morning weather was pleasant, almost cool, before the oppressive heat and humidity that came later that day. I was talking with the leaders of the movement at a registration desk set up along the reflection pool in front of the Lincoln Memorial. I was introduced to John Lewis by another famous leader of the movement, Julian Bond. Together, they had organized the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC. John asked me to join a new SNCC project, yet unnamed, to register Black citizens to vote in Mississippi the next year. John was kind, engaging, and as I recall, incredibly polite. I signed my name on the dotted line as a volunteer for what later became known as Freedom Summer. I lied about my age because I thought if I told the truth, I'd be turned down. Almost every one of us of any age joining our talk this morning has heard about the March on Washington. Dr. King's I Have a Dream speech is one of the great moments in civil rights history, in American history. John Lewis's speech that day is also familiar to many of us. Both speeches reflect a country trying to come to grips with its racism. The March on Washington would be in the tradition and the spirit of a great prayer meeting, a prayer meeting to raise money and consciousness. Civil rights activists from all over the country were poised to gather in front of the Lincoln Memorial as a call to America's conscience. It was a bold gamble. In the wee hours of Wednesday morning, August 28, 1963, I left New York City on a Greyhound bus bound for our nation's capital. As our bus entered the area just outside Washington, I could see fires. Everyone could see the fires in the distance surrounding the entire Capitol. At first, we didn't know what to expect. It was still dark, and the fires painted kind of a frightening glow in the pre-dawn hours. However, as our bus came closer, I realized dozens, scores of people were holding highway flares and signs reading, "We're with you, and we shall overcome." These people had gotten up in the middle of the night to wish us well. That is when I first realized the March on Washington was going to be something unique, was going to be something different from the demonstrations in which I'd been involved previously. There were large identified groups of Protestants, Catholics, and Jews at the march. It was not a black march. It was what Dr. King referred to as a coalition of conscience when he spoke the next year at UCLA. That is what it took to make a change in society. The march itself was a blur of speeches, singing mixed with a spirit of solidarity and common purpose. Singing folk songs about freedom and liberation with 250,000 others was one of the greatest highs I've ever experienced. We joined hands and lifted our voices to the sky. It was deeply connecting and uplifting. I marched slowly, step by step, from the Washington Monument along the reflection pool closer to the Lincoln Memorial. One of the forgotten speakers that day was, for me, one of the most riveting. Rabbi Dr. Joachim Prinz had the honor of speaking immediately before Dr. King. Rabbi Prinz had devoted much of his life in the United States to the civil rights movement. He saw the plight of African Americans and other minority groups in the context of his own experiences under Hitler. He was the only one to mention and compare the Japanese incarceration during World War II with the movement that day. He was president of the American Jewish Congress, which was a key organizer of the march itself. He said, quote, "When I was the rabbi of the Jewish community in Berlin under the Hitler regime, I learned many things. The most important thing that I learned under those tragic circumstances was that bigotry and hatred are not the most urgent problem. The most urgent, the most disgraceful, the most shameful, and the most tragic is silence." With that, he paused. Hardly a sound could be heard from the 250,000 people in attendance. Everything stopped, and the silence was deafening. He continued, referring to Germany, "A great people which had created a great civilization had become a nation of silent onlookers. They remained silent in the face of hate, in the face of brutality, and in the face of mass murder." Quote, "America must not become a nation of bystanders. America must not remain silent. It must speak up and act. He concluded, "The time, I believe, has come to work together, for it is not enough to hope together, and it is not enough to pray together." Excuse me. So, what is the historical significance of the March on Washington? I think Peter Yarrow of Peter, Paul, and Mary, who sang that day, said it best. Until that point, nobody had the idea that ordinary people standing together in this kind of way could change history. That awareness fueled the creation of the women's movement, the environmental movement, the anti-war movement, the Black Lives Matter movement. All the movements were born out of that awareness, an awareness that we can do this. I believe the lesson of the March on Washington is the understanding that the march itself became the example for all movements to come. A diverse gathering, grounded in unanimity, informed by nonviolence, and focused on America's notion of democracy, equality, fairness, and justice. We can do this. Next, the birth of American racism and the great lie. In order to appreciate the Black Lives Matter movement, the urgency of its demands to reimagine our police, the degree of frustration and fear that African Americans and people of color face each day, we must understand a bit of our history and how we arrived at the present moment. We need to understand not only the facts of that history, but to feel their emotional impact as well. Paraphrasing Dr. Scott Mitchell, Dean of the Institute of Buddhist Studies, I suggest that we have to be open to new ways of looking at racism in America today, open to new ideas. We need to be fearless in this regard, because being attached to old narratives is both an attachment, something we Buddhists are not supposed to have, right? And leaves us stuck in the past, unable to recognize the truth of new narratives. Bryan Stevenson is a Black civil rights lawyer in Alabama and founder of the Equal Justice Initiative. I believe he is one of the clearest voices about racism in America today. Bryan Stevenson comments, "I don't think we're free in America. I think we're all burdened by this history of racial injustice, which has created a narrative of racial difference, which has infected us and allowed us to see the world through this lens. So it becomes necessary to talk about that history if we want to get free." For me, Stevenson says, the great evil of American slavery wasn't involuntary servitude and forced labor. It was this narrative of racial difference. It turned into decades of terrorism and violence, targeting people of color. And this terrorism has profound implications for a range of contemporary issues. He continued, "We need to engage in a more honest accounting of what it means to be a slave society, what it means to be a place where terrorism and mass atrocities took place, what it means to have been an apartheid country for decades. If we have that appreciation, things will change." I believe that. Reconstruction lasted only 12 years, from 1865 to 1877. So why is it important today? Eric Foner, America's most notable historian on the Reconstruction period, makes it clear that the racism we confront today, all over America, was made possible by what took place during this 12-year period following the Civil War. That, he says, quote, "was the really critical moment. It's only because we gave in to this murder and lynching and unrelenting atrocities, and because we listened to the lies being told to justify such barbaric behavior, that we see the racism we do today. We must not become a nation of bystanders. Our silence would be shameful. The fierce resistance to Reconstruction gave birth to the systemic racism we see in America. It provided fertile ground for white supremacy. The narrative that Black lives don't matter, that Black Americans are less than whites, less intelligent, less capable, not quite fully human. Reconstruction haunts us today because it gave birth to what some of us call the great lie. So what happened during Reconstruction that makes it important for us to even talk about? I see it as a combination of two themes: the great lie, and second, the horrific and relentless lynching, torture, and murder it spawned. First, the great lie. Andrew Johnson became president of the United States because he was vice president when Abraham Lincoln was assassinated in 1865. Andrew Johnson is described by historians as renowned for his lies, the lies he told the public and the press. He distorted the truth to feed his own political aims. He issued executive orders, then called proclamations, to pursue his undemocratic and racist actions. Those proclamations led to the passage of Black codes in the South that deprived freed men and women of their civil liberties. He was reckless and emotionally volatile. He was eventually impeached. His presidency was marked by deadly domestic terrorism. African Americans were attacked with impunity. He coordinated voter suppression and fomented fierce debates about who is and who is not entitled to American citizenship. He opposed passage of the 14th Amendment, which offered citizenship to former slaves. He embraced notions of white supremacy and made no effort to heal a divided nation. Sound familiar? Leaders who revise history and lie about it to serve their own political ends are insidious, because when such lies continue unabated, they begin to infect our ability to see the truth. The repetition of such lies creeps bit by bit into our psyche, and before long, it begins to replace the truth. It makes compromise difficult, if not impossible. These lies begin to erode our democratic institutions, our notions of equality, and our ability to hear, to really hear the pain of those suffering. The second phase of Reconstruction was the unrelenting horror. The groundbreaking report from the Equal Justice Initiative, released just this year, reveals that more than 6,500 African American men, women, and children were hanged, burned alive, shot, drowned, and beaten to death by white mobs between 1877 and 1950. That's about 89 deaths every year on the average, almost 2 each week. More than 2,000 Black people were lynched just during the 12 years of Reconstruction. The numbers are staggering. Millions more fled the South as refugees from this racial terrorism, profoundly impacting our entire nation. The report documents 34 mass lynchings. In Opelousas, Louisiana, in 1868, an estimated 200 Black people were killed over just a few days after attempting to participate in the political process. The report reveals that available records paint a haunting and devastating picture. Across the South, there were near daily acts of lynching and assault as recently as 1950. In 1964, 5 young men were beaten, tortured, and murdered in Mississippi. In 1998, James Byrd Jr. was dragged to his death for 3 miles along an asphalt road by 3 white supremacists in Texas. the atrocities continue. As Brian Stevenson commented, the United States has done very little to acknowledge the legacy of slavery, lynching, and racial segregation. As a result, people of color are disproportionately marginalized, disadvantaged, and mistreated. During the period of the civil rights movement, in the middle of the 20th century, it became possible for the first time in history to show people the horror of murder, lynching, and torture. Newsreel footage, then television, and more recently social media have made it hard to deny what we can all see with our own eyes. Next, the story of Emmett Till. One of the most shocking events of the civil rights movement began on August 24, 1955, in the Mississippi Delta. On that day, 14-year-old Emmett Till and a few other boys went to a grocery store in Money, Mississippi. According to some reports, he whistled at the white cashier, Carolyn Bryant. Other reports that he made inappropriate comments. 3 days later, his corpse was found in the Tallahatchie River, unrecognizable from his wounds. He had been brutally beaten, and a 75-pound cotton gin was tied around his neck with barbed wire. But it was his mother's reaction and what she did that made national and international headlines. 2 white men, members of the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, Bryant and Millam, were arrested for the murder. The white townspeople raised $10,000 for their defense. After 1 hour of deliberation, the all-white jury acquitted the 2 men. It had taken an hour because the jury had stopped for a soda before returning to the courthouse. 1 year following their acquittal, in a 1956 interview with Look magazine, they both brazenly confessed to the murder. In an effort to share this history from an emotional as well as a factual standpoint, I'd like to share a series of video clips that I have collected, made up largely of historical and documentary footage. First, let me share a 4-minute video with you. Please turn up your volume when it starts and display the video full screen if you can. Note also on this first video, the first 15 seconds of the video is silent. First, I have a warning. The video is very difficult to watch, and some may not wish to see it. So you may wish to turn away during that 4 minutes. Koichi, would you please cue the Emmett Till video?
I believe that the whole United States is mourning with me, and if the death of my son can mean something to the other unfortunate people all over the world, then for him to have died a hero would mean more to me than for him just to have died.
Emmett Till, 14, was kidnapped and killed allegedly for wolf whistling at the wife of accused Roy Bryant.
It's not just that they discover his body and that he's been killed. He has been brutally, brutally beaten. As a criminal defense attorney, when we look at crimes, we often try to put together a picture about what happened, and it takes a lot of hatred and a lot of rage to do the kind of violence that was done to Emmett Till. Being a black boy in the American South could be quite perilous. The allegation that Emmett Till was being social with a white woman was considered an affront, a threat to the racial order. And I think the shock of his death was compounded by the brutality of his death. Emmett's mother couldn't actually conform to the conventions of the time, and she did something really quite remarkable. She made the really unorthodox choice of having a funeral with an open casket that was going to be very widely publicized, that was going to be attended by the national press. She wanted civil rights leaders and political leaders to see what they did to her child. She invited David Jackson and Jet magazine to take pictures of this child's battered body. And these images were widely circulated. Jet magazine was a publication that was primarily produced and distributed to the African American community that had been trying to educate the rest of the country about the horrors of segregation and racial violence and lynching in the American South. And the images were really, really challenging. It was the kind of visual that you didn't typically see. You certainly didn't see it outside of a war zone, and you certainly didn't see it with children. His face was grotesque. You could see eyes, but you couldn't really distinguish all of his facial features. That's how much violence he had been subjected to. Emmett's mother's presence in the photo is really important because she's really giving witness to victimization and violence. The other images that Emmett's mother provided just created this notion of a very respectable young boy who was trying to make the very best impression on everyone he met. The juxtaposition of a little boy in a suit and a tie with his battered face was a stark image that made it really impossible for anyone who saw it to be silent about it. Mainstream publications like Look and Life began talking about this issue. It became an issue that elected officials were being questioned about. These images made it impossible for white families in other parts of the country to stay indifferent, to stay neutral.
Thank you, Koichi. This was the first time in history that technology, film, and video were used to prove that these kinds of atrocities really did occur. Next, the Children's March. By April of 1963, the civil rights movement was at its lowest ebb. The last major achievement of the movement had occurred 8 years earlier in 1955 with the protests in the wake of Emmett Till's murder and Rosa Parks' refusal to sit in the back of a segregated bus. It seemed the movement had reached its end. In May of 1963, the Children's March in Birmingham, Alabama took place. Today, to be politically correct, we would call it the Young Person's March. The march is the story of how young people, many of high school age, faced fear, arrest, fire hoses, beatings, and police dogs, and brought segregation to its knees. It is living proof, in my opinion, that teenagers and those in their 20s and 30s can change history. I'd like to share some film clips totaling about 13 minutes in all from a film called Mighty Times, The Children's March. I've edited them, and I apologize to all of you for its length, 13 minutes. But this video will help you better than my words can to appreciate what took place in Birmingham, Alabama. As with the murder of Emmett Till, only the advent of actual film footage and video really brings home the message. Koichi, would you please cue the Children's March video?
Birmingham, Alabama, 1963. It was the most racist, most segregated city in the South. On April 12, 1963, Martin Luther King left his room at the Gaston Motel and walked 2 blocks to the 16th Street Baptist Church, where a gathering of protesters joined him for a march on City Hall. He had targeted Birmingham as the site for mass demonstrations against segregation, but the masses had failed to materialize, and King decided to go to jail himself. The nation watched quietly as King was placed in solitary confinement. 1963 would mark Dr. King's lowest point as leader of the civil rights movement.
That was a beautiful concept after you think about it later. But when you get your head knocked on, you really gotta think real hard and twice. Because the fellas down on 15th Street, those fellas would fight back. They came to fight. But because of Dr. King and them girls, they would say, y'all come on, cooperate. We need a peaceful protest.
On Saturday, April 20th, Dr. King bonded out of jail. His release caused barely a ripple.
We were defeated here in Birmingham. They had beaten us down into the ground.
Dr. King, in our strategy session, says that the only way to break Birmingham, we're going to have to fill the jails. So I say, I agree. I absolutely agree with you on that. Now, how I fill the jail is my business.
I remember that night, Dr. King speaking, he was trying like mad to get somebody to go to jail, and they just didn't stand.
I remember King inviting any volunteers to go to jail the next day, and nobody stood up but us kids.
That was it. Nobody volunteered but those kids.
Dr. King said no.
Good morning, children. It's Shelley the Playboy here on WENN.
D-Day was the day, I tell you. This was the day where every student in Birmingham knew that it was going to happen.
But you gotta remember that all of the planning was a secret.
Good. Good morning, children.
The DJs would talk in code and use songs from the hit parade as signals for action.
I remember that morning I woke up with my mind on freedom.
Oh, I took special pain with putting a little starch in my blouse.
Got my toothbrush and I got the toothpaste, the soap.
Because I had a feeling that I wouldn't be coming home.
Ring, ring goes the bell. The disc jockeys pushed D-Day early in the morning, but they wouldn't even use D-Day. They used all that jive talk.
Don't forget, kids, there's gonna be a party in the park, and don't forget your toothbrushes, because luncheon will be served.
Back in the classroom, open your book. Now everybody who's listening knows what the deal is.
D-Day was the day. My mother said, okay, Gwen, don't go to that march. I mean, don't go. You go to school. The more we walked, the more we gathered, and every once in a while you look back and you saw it was more kids coming from somewhere, from another direction. You said, where are all these kids coming from?
You had never seen that many people in your life. It's like a football game.
Kids walked as far as 18 miles to get to Birmingham in order to be arrested. And the purpose was to go to jail.
The gathering place was 16th Street Baptist Church.
Oh, we poured into 16th Street like a waterfall.
They were coming in all doors, from all directions, from the basement, from the back.
It was just like one big pep rally. Here's Park, are you in the house? Or Western, are you in the house?
And who's out here from Western tonight?
Children were ready. They were ready to hit the streets.
Kelly Ingram Park was the big green buffer between black Birmingham and the white downtown. 16th Street Baptist Church was on one corner, and by noon, Birmingham's finest were on the other. It was all laid out like a battlefield.
To think about it now, I get the shakes. What could have happened?
Martin Luther King spent the day at his motel, wrestling with his conscience.
A lot of people thought the kids were going to get hurt. But the reality of it was that we were born black in Alabama, and we were going to get hurt if we didn't do something.
When noon came and went without a public appearance by King, Bevel opened the floodgates. They came out in waves of 50.
The first 50 came out, he peacefully arrested him. That does it. And the next 50 shows up, and the next 50, he go get some more paddy wagons.
They would cram the paddy wagons full of people, and then they would jam the doors shut.
Within an hour, the police had abandoned wagons and started to bring in school buses.
Fill up a bus, pull up another bus, fill it up. We arrested those kids in wholesale numbers.
Bevel timed it so that each group of 50 seemed like the last.
And what they didn't know was as the kids were going out of the front door, more kids were coming in the back door.
50. So it's like, when they gonna stop?
I think when the police arrested us, they thought that we would be afraid and start to cry. They had strange looks to see that we were happy and singing and glad to be arrested.
Listen up, brothers and sisters. If today was D-Day, tomorrow will be double D-Day.
By day 2, the word was out, and more than 3,000 spectators converged on the church to watch. But no one could have imagined what they were about to see.
When we got to the park, police was lined up.
They were marching, got ready. Oh, good Lord, I scared to death. And then the officers gave the order to open up.
They aimed for your head to knock you down. And that water had pressure behind it. It hurt.
During the meeting the day before, they had told us the policeman might hit you, the policeman might have dogs, they might spit on you, they might kick you. But I remember thinking that no one said anything about water hoses.
You could see that the first blast of water dispersed the crowds. But when the water subsided, there were 10 kids still standing. and they were singing one word over and over.
The crowd surged back behind them. The firemen were certainly faced with 200, then 500 protesters.
Bull Connor standing there with his hands on his hips. Shoot the water on those niggers.
The water was so powerful that 4 men couldn't hold it steady.
We could hear the firemen yelling, "Knock the niggers down."
The hose rolled me right down the street, like a sheet of paper.
And look, it would sting so bad.
Suddenly you could see against the sky these bricks and stones.
They were calling us SOBs and bastards, and it started with the rocks and the bottles.
They were arresting them as fast as they could.
Bull came through with that damn tank. And black folk were throwing and hitting that tank with balls, rocks.
Bull Connor would tell them,
Bring the dogs out.
Most of the dogs were on a leash, but if you reach out, the dog's gonna bite you.
There was this vicious big old dog that turned loose on this smaller child, and the dog lunged at his throat, and it hit him and bit him.
Bull Connor was beat by the young people of the city of Birmingham.
But what really surprised us was when Kennedy came on television and addressed the nation and said, "This is the end of segregation."
We are confronted primarily with a moral issue. It is as old as the scriptures and is as clear as the American Constitution. The heart of the question is whether all Americans are to be afforded equal rights and equal opportunities, whether we are going to treat our fellow Americans as we want to be treated.
I remember watching the president on TV, and I knew he was talking about me.
If an American, because his skin is dark, cannot enjoy the full and free life which all of us want, then who among us would be content to have the color of his skin changed and stand in his place?
And once he made that statement, it's like tears start flowing. It's like, oh man, this guy gonna preach. And he went on and on and on.
Now the time has come for this nation to fulfill its promise.
The Children's March broke the back of Birmingham. Birmingham led to the March on Washington. Birmingham changed the South in an incredible way.
Thank you all for hanging in there during that 13-minute sorry. Thank you for hanging in there during the during that entire video. Let me add this to the information on the Children's March. On day one of the Children's March, 973 young people were arrested. On day two, 1,922 were arrested. And on day three, 4,163 were arrested. By its end, more than 7,000 young people were involved. The police were brought to its knees. Bull Connor was removed as the de facto police chief after 7 terms. Segregation was ended in Alabama, but not the struggle, not the setbacks, nor the racism that spawned it to begin with and with which we live today. Next, Freedom Summer, 1964, Mississippi. 10 months later, following both the Children's March in Birmingham and the March in Washington, Freedom Summer arrived. Together, today, we call it Freedom Summer. However, for many of us living in Mississippi at the time, it was a time of terror. Shortly after sunrise on a Saturday morning in 1964, I hugged and kissed my grandfather goodbye, left our chicken farm in the Catskill Mountains of New York, and went off to fight for freedom. I participated as a volunteer, a foot soldier, in Mississippi during the long summer of 1964. Most of the time, I lived with a Black family in the Mississippi Delta, a region of immense poverty. It was in the same area, the Delta area, that Emmett Till had been murdered in 1955. We worked to register Black citizens to vote and to teach Black history in freedom schools. We endured bullying, beatings, arrests, and murders. It was this summer in the Mississippi Delta area that 3 student volunteers, Mickey Schwerner, Andy Goodman, and James Chaney, were kidnapped, beaten, and murdered. Let me share just a 2-minute brief video about Freedom Summer. Koichi, would you please cue the Freedom Summer video?
I don't think people understand how violent Mississippi was. Terrorism led Black people to the obvious conclusion. If they try and vote, they're messing with white folks' business, and they can get hurt or killed.
We hope to send into Mississippi this summer upwards of 1,000 students from all around the country who will engage in what we're calling freedom schools, community center programs, voter registration activity, and in general, a program designed to open up Mississippi to the country.
The burned out station wagon in which the 3 civil rights workers were last seen has been processed by FBI laboratory investigators.
I knew it was going to be bad. I didn't dream for a minute that people would be killed. But it was always in the back of everybody's mind that bad things were going to happen. So it was terrifying. But if you cared about this country and you cared about democracy, then you had to go down.
Thank you. The murders of Andy Goodman, James Chaney, and Mickey Schwerner, 3 young men I came to know, was the first and last triple interracial lynching in the United States. The tragedy was that it took the murder of 2 young white men to get the attention of America, because Black lives didn't matter. One historian later reported accurately, "We all spent time searching. We found many dead bodies around the state. Almost all were Black people who had been killed and discarded, some in shallow graves, some in the weeds and bushes, and even some by the side of the road. I reluctantly became acquainted with the smell of death." I have spoken many times about my experiences as a student volunteer during Freedom Summer to BCA audiences, to other groups interested in the civil rights movement. I've talked about the many times I was beaten and arrested, about the time I spent in jail, my interactions with Dr. King and other senior leaders of the movement. I'm glad to provide more details about that summer again, if you like. Just ask me during the Q&A. Thank you. We confronted an organized white resistance during Freedom Summer, more savage than any of us imagined. The report of the Southern Poverty Law Center continues, by the end of the summer, 80 student volunteers had been beaten, 35 shot at, 5 murdered, and more than 20 Black churches had been burned to the ground in Mississippi alone. On one occasion, I was beaten so badly that I was hospitalized for a week. Although the murders of James Chaney, Andy Goodman, and Mickey Schwerner received worldwide attention, 2 other victims of the Ku Klux Klan went practically unnoticed. They were Charles Moore and Henry D., young Black Mississippians who had disappeared in early May of that year. Their mutilated bodies were discovered in the Mississippi River during the massive search for the 3 civil rights workers, run by the FBI and assisted by 1,000 Freedom Summer volunteers. I know, because I was directly involved in the discovery of their bodies. I'd like to try to draw some lessons from the appalling history of racism and brutality that I've shared with you this morning, and which still exists in our country today. What is the takeaway from the Black Lives Matter demonstrations this year? What are the lessons we can draw from the constant, unrelenting period of terror experienced by Blacks for hundreds of years? Bryan Stevenson, the Alabama social justice lawyer I mentioned earlier, with whom I am proud to have corresponded with about these very issues, is a voice worth hearing. More than that, I believe, as others have commented publicly, that Bryan Stevenson is the voice of Dr. King in this 21st century. I know that's a high bar, but I believe it's true nevertheless. In a recent interview published in the New Yorker magazine, he comments, quote, "We need to reckon with our history of racial injustice. I think everything we're seeing is a symptom of a larger disease. We've never honestly addressed all the damage that was done during the 2.5 centuries that we enslaved Black people. The great evil of American slavery wasn't the involuntary servitude. It was the fiction that Black people aren't as good as white people, aren't the equals of white people, are less evolved, less human, less capable, less worthy, less deserving than white people. I think this is the great lie we must confront." Stevenson continues, "That ideology of white supremacy was necessary to justify enslavement, and it is the legacy of slavery we haven't acknowledged. This is why, he argues, slavery didn't end in 1865. It just evolved." Stevenson again, "So for me, you can't understand these present day issues without understanding the persistent refusal to view Black people as equals. It has changed, but that history of violence, where we used terror and intimidation and lynching and Jim Crow laws and then police, created this presumption of dangerousness and guilt. It doesn't matter how hard you try, how educated you are, where you go in this country. If you're Black or you're brown or you're different, you're going to have to navigate that presumption. And that makes encounters with the police just rife with the potential for these specific outcomes, which we've seen just this year with George Floyd, Jacob Blake, and others. In discussing these issues with my good friend Piper Toyama, past president of the Hawaii Shin Buddhist Kyodan, he said, quote, "We're unable to fully absorb into our innermost being the sadness of Black parents warning their children how to behave in the presence of police officers, of living the daily indignities that ignorant people heap upon Black human beings, of the uncertainty of just being in the midst of people who are not Black, of the ravages of 400 years of continuous, unrelenting oppression on the Black human being's sense of self-worth. We have no idea," he said, "what such sadness, fear, and uncertainty can do to a person's soul. If we did, we would not need to ask the question, why can't Blacks pick themselves up by their bootstraps and succeed as other minorities have?" Close quote. I think it's important to appreciate that each act of terror, lynching, and violence visited against Blacks in America didn't occur every 10 or 20 years with a break, a sigh of relief in between. Instead, it was unrelenting, virtually every month, sometimes day to day, from the end of the Civil War at least through 1950. These acts of intimidation, of brutality, may not occur with this frequency today. That's true. But as we've witnessed with our own eyes, it continues seemingly without respite. Let me share one final video clip, about 3 minutes in length, of an interview on the PBS NewsHour with Brian Stevenson as he talks about race. Koichi, would you please cue the PBS NewsHour video?
Finally, another in our brief but spectacular series. Tonight, attorney Brian Stevenson, a longtime advocate for criminal justice reform, shares his thoughts on race and the legal system.
I was doing a hearing in the Midwest. I had my suit and tie on. I was there early. It was the first time I'd been in that courtroom. And I sat down at defense counsel's table, as I always do, and the judge walked in, and the judge said, hey, you get back out there and you wait out there in the hallway until your lawyer gets here. I don't want any defendant sitting in my courtroom without their lawyer. And I stood up and I said, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I didn't introduce myself. My name is Brian Stevenson. I am the lawyer. And the judge started laughing, and the prosecutor started laughing, and I made myself laugh because I didn't want to disadvantage my client. But afterward, I was thinking, what is it that when this judge saw a middle-aged black man, it didn't even occur to him that that man sitting at defense counsel's table was the lawyer? And I worry about that judge. I worry that he's sentencing defendants of color more harshly. I worry that he doesn't value and accept the testimony of black and brown witnesses the way he does other people. I worry that a narrative of racial difference compromises his ability to provide fair and just treatment of all people. I don't think we're free in America. I think we are burdened by our history of racial inequality. We have a history of horrific mistreatment of people based on color. And I think that narrative of racial difference that was cultivated to justify that mistreatment has created a kind of smog, and we've all been breathing it in. If you read the 13th Amendment, it doesn't talk about narratives of racial difference. It doesn't talk about ideologies of white supremacy. It only talks about involuntary servitude and forced labor. And because of that, I don't think slavery ended in 1865. I think it just evolved. We had decades of terrorism and violence where black people were pulled out of their homes, burned alive, hung, beaten to death, sometimes literally on the courthouse lawn, and we never talked about that. And then we had this era of civil rights resistance to racial segregation, and we've made progress, but we haven't confronted the narrative of racial difference. Unlike South Africa, where you are required to hear about the damage done by apartheid. Unlike Germany, in Berlin, Germany, you can't go 100 meters without seeing markers or stones or monuments placed near the homes of Jewish families abducted during the Holocaust. But in this country, we don't talk about slavery. We don't talk about lynching. We don't talk about segregation, and our silence has condemned us. When I went to Harvard Law School my first year, I didn't want people to know I started my education in a colored school. I didn't want them to know I was the great-grandson of enslaved people. I thought it might diminish me. And then I realized that my power, if I have any, my strength, if I have any, my insight, if I have any, was shaped by those people who survived slavery. And it's in that story of survival that I think we have some greatness that we can offer, and not just people of color, but all of us who have learned to overcome. My name is Brian Stevenson, and this is my brief but spectacular take on justice in America.
Thank you, Koichi. Permit me a few closing comments. First, about police. Police have regrettably been the face of racial oppression in countless ways. As Stevenson comments, before the Civil War, law enforcement was complicit in sustaining enslavement. It was the police who were tasked with tracking down fugitive slaves from 1850 onwards in the North. After emancipation, it was law enforcement that stepped back and allowed Black communities to be terrorized and victimized. We had an overthrow of government during Reconstruction, and law enforcement facilitated that. Then throughout the first half of the 20th century, it was law enforcement and police and our justice system that allowed people to be lynched by white mobs, sometimes literally on the courthouse steps, and allowed the perpetrators of that terror and violence to engage in these acts of murder with impunity. That identity of violence and oppression is not something we can ignore. We have to address it. But rather than address it, since the 1960s civil rights movement, we've been trying to distract ourselves from it and not engage, not acknowledge it, not own up to it. And all of our efforts have been compromised by this refusal to recognize that we need to radically change the structure of police in the United States. There has never been, to my knowledge, an acknowledgement that we were wrong and we are sorry. And because of that silence, the police don't think they did anything wrong over the last 50 or 60 years. Stevenson continues, it's not just anger over what happened to George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, or Jacob Blake. It is anger about continuing to live in a world where there is this presumption of dangerousness and guilt wherever you go, every day. It is not slavery which all Americans must confront to begin addressing the racism we see in our daily news. That is not what we need to own up to, nor the unacceptable terror of waking up every day, any day, wondering whether a policeman will stop, intimidate, arrest, or murder my innocent son or daughter. It is this narrative of inequality we all grew up with that we must confront. Where in our souls, our inner selves, does this sometimes subconscious narrative reside? The one that tells us Black people are less than we are. In conclusion, I'd like to offer one more story about John Lewis. In August of 1964, near the end of Freedom Summer, I was told that John Lewis wanted to meet with 3 summer volunteers, myself and 2 other white volunteers. The 3 of us had risen to a position of some authority in the movement that summer. John had previously talked with us about helping to organize a SNCC project the next year in Selma, Alabama, and we were eager to help. Yet this meeting was different. We met around the kitchen table of a local Black family. I immediately noticed something different, something unexpected from John. He didn't have his usual air of confidence, conviction, and assurance. He told us that elements in the movement wanted an all-Black leadership the next year, not white. We were welcome to join and participate, he said, but we would not be in any position of authority. We were disappointed. We had all endured beatings, some serious. Friends had been murdered. We were willing to risk our lives. Nevertheless, we told John we understood. 3 years later, while I was still an undergraduate at UCLA, I got a telephone call from John Lewis. We talked for what I recall was a long time. After the march in Selma, John had been forced out and replaced as president of SNCC by a more militant leader of the movement. So why did he call? He called me that day to apologize. He said that he regretted telling the 3 of us a few years earlier that we were excluded from a more active role in the movement because we were white. I was deeply touched by his honesty and his own soul searching. I confessed to him that I'd lied about my age when I registered to join Freedom Summer. He said it wasn't important and that he suspected it anyway. We ended that conversation better friends than we had been, because we had shared shameful, intimate, and unflattering truths about ourselves with each other. Quoting from Barack Obama's eulogy for John Lewis, he says, "That's what John Lewis teaches us. That's where real courage comes from, not from turning on each other, but by turning towards one another, not by sowing hatred and division, but by spreading love and truth, not by avoiding our responsibilities to create a better America and a better world, but by embracing those responsibilities with joy and perseverance, and discovering that in our beloved community, we do not walk alone." Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Rick, for your presentation. I feel that these topics are very necessary and relevant, especially to the times that we're in now. And I really appreciate how you're bringing awareness to America's true past and for setting the stage for what I hope will continue conversations on social justice and equity. So thank you very much for your presentation. At this time, I would like to ask Bishop Reverend Harada to assist in closing the lecture portion with Gasho at this time.
Okay. Thank you very much. Gasho, please. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu. Namo Amida Butsu.
So thank you, Rick, for your wonderful talk. And we'll start with a couple of questions from Roberto Loiterman, who's asked two questions. And the first one is, can you share with us some of your experiences during Freedom Summer in Mississippi? And also, how did you meet Dr. Martin Luther King?
Thank you. Thank you for that. Let me share, do this with a story of 4 or 5 minutes long, no longer. I recall it's 1964, summertime, Mississippi. I recall vividly it was on a Tuesday morning after a summer rain in a town called Chula, Mississippi, that I watched an elderly, frail Black woman being intentionally tripped. Later, I learned her name was Sarah. Sarah tried to help a Black teenage boy who was being mercilessly bullied, pushed, and screamed at by a white man. I vividly recall onlookers laughing at her as she fell down a short flight of wooden stairs into the gutter. When I extended my hand to help Sarah get up, I was grabbed by a policeman standing nearby and beaten unconscious. When I woke up, I found myself in the hospital. I later learned I was denied admittance to the White Hospital. I could barely see because my eyes were almost completely shut from the beating. Every part of me hurt. It seemed as though I could feel my brain hurting, although even today I can't quite explain to you what that means. However, I was really not scared till I looked into a mirror. I looked kind of like Rocky after a prize fight. Eyes black and closed shut, and a face like a cauliflower. A few days later, late one night while I was recovering in that hospital, I looked up through my half-closed eyes and saw Dr. Martin Luther King leaning over me. He asked in a quiet tone of voice how I was. He told me that I had put myself between Sarah and the policeman's billy club and was struck in the head and in the face. I have no memory of that at all, even to this day. But I will always remember my first meeting with Dr. King and the kiss that he planted on my forehead before he left. I spent more than a week in the hospital and still suffer some of the nerve damage from that beating. But to answer the second part of the question about an interactions with Dr. King, let me tell another short story. I gained a bit of a reputation that summer in Mississippi, both among my comrades serving in Freedom Summer, as well as in the Black community. I call it unearned intimacy. Unearned intimacy to me is kind of like a fame that you don't deserve, like a myth. You know, people want to believe it was true, and every time I told them it wasn't, they believed it even more. So it was early one July, very hot, humid July morning, that we learned that another Baptist church had been burned to the ground by white racists in the community. Can you imagine going to your place of worship, your Buddhist temple, and finding it had been intentionally burned to the ground? Can you imagine? As was often the case, 3 of us in the movement rushed to the church to try and help out salvaging what was left. I was joined that morning by 2 friends, Chuck Kohler and Bart Lesson, both from Akron, Ohio. When we arrived at the church, or what was left of it, it was still smoldering from the fire. There was kind of a weird smell in the dry, hot air, and you could still see smoke in some places. It was really dreadful. Chuck thought that he heard a sound coming from under some of the embers. Now, let me explain. Some of these 19th century churches had cellars that were kind of hidden from view with doors that were lying almost flat or parallel to the ground itself. They're like storm doors. And these old cellars had been built as a sanctuary for escaping slaves back in pre-Civil War days. At first, we ignored the sounds, thinking it was some of the burning embers that were still crackling. But a few minutes later, when all of us thought we heard it, we started digging, thinking maybe, just maybe, somebody had survived. As we pulled more of the burnt wood away, we uncovered the old cellar door and heard sounds that grew louder. Suddenly, I remember the door was pushed open from the inside out, and 3 young girls reached out their tiny arms, and we easily pulled them out. They were covered in black soot and frightened by the experience, of course, but otherwise they were physically unhurt. Then, it seems in my memory like seconds later, one of the girls' mothers, Miss Minnie Josephson, who was searching for what she was certain was her daughter's dead body, came running over to us, screaming, and immediately embraced her daughter and the other girls. Although we told her we hadn't done anything to save anybody, we had merely pushed aside some wood to uncover the cellar in which they'd been hiding. We became instant heroes of the community. The word spread that 3 white boys had rescued 3 black girls from the fire. I received cards and letters from the Josephson family for more than 30 years. So how does this story connect with Dr. King? Dr. King and the senior leaders of the movement heard that some young kid, me, that he talked with in the hospital weeks earlier, had saved the life of not 1, but 3 young girls living in the Mississippi Delta. That was how my buddies and I got an invitation, undeserved, from Dr. King to meet up in Greenville, Mississippi the next Sunday for lunch after church. Kind of like a tokie. That was when Dr. King and I really talked for the first time. We shared a love of food, and we ate together plates of fried chicken, steamed white rice, and glasses of beer and sweet tea that never seemed to stop coming. We talked about the movement and Reverend King's early focus on the issue of poverty. He taught me to eat his favorite dessert, warm pecan pie with a shot of rye whiskey poured over it. We met a number of times at that tiny restaurant for Sunday lunch. The last time I had lunch with Dr. King was on April 27, 1965, when he spoke at UCLA. It was a highly significant time, as it was just 1 month and 2 days after the triumphant march from Selma to Montgomery. It's depicted in a movie called Selma that I highly recommend. There was no pecan pie, but I was treated like family. 3 years later, in 1968, Dr. King was assassinated. And so, although I have many more stories, that'll suffice, and I appreciate the question. Back to you, Sydney.
Thank you so much, Rick. I want to hear all your stories. We have several questions about BCA and Shin Buddhism, and I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about how Shin Buddhism connects with this civic engagement that you've discussed today?
This isn't the first time I heard this. This was emailed to me a few days ago, and it's also a subject I've thought a lot about, the connection between our school of Buddhism and civic engagement. I am not a Buddhist minister. I am not an assistant Buddhist minister. I am not a minister's assistant. I'm none of those. I'm just a lay person, a bamboo, talking about their religious beliefs and how it relates to the social engagement that we've discussed this morning. So I'm only speaking for myself. I believe that Shin Buddhists ought to be involved in issues of social justice, seeking to ensure equality and justice for all people, regardless of status. I appreciate the contrary view of other Shin Buddhists, of some ministers, that such engagement is not, in their opinion, religiously appropriate. I believe that Buddhist notions of kindness, equality, and connection also guide my thinking. So given what is happening in our communities, the notions of kindness, equality, and connection with all beings have to find expression, in my judgment, in engagement with real-world issues. Professor Takamaro Shigaraki, who I was introduced to by Reverend Harada and Reverend David Matsumoto, was a profoundly spiritual person who was also a disciplined and rigorous scholar, recognized as one of the world's leading Shin Buddhist thinkers. He always urged his students to come to their own understandings of Shinran, our founder, and manifest their own understandings in their own personal, societal, and cultural contexts. As a result, a number of Professor Shigaraki's students have been very active academically, religiously, institutionally, as well as politically and socially in Japan and all around the world. Dr. Matsumoto, Dr. David Matsumoto, teaches that one need not feel that you have to find words or phrases in Shinran or Dr. Shigaraki that justify or authenticate your own theories. Rather, you can identify what you've learned from them and then articulate how your own understanding enables you to engage the Shin Buddhist path in today's world. For me, that understanding extends directly to Buddhist teachings of equality, interdependence, and kindness towards all beings. How can I remain silent in the face of the horrors we've discussed this morning? I can't. I can't because of who I am and because of my Shin Buddhist beliefs. I believe we must not be silent. I believe we must stand up for our rights as human beings, for the justice and equality under the law to which we're all entitled, and in active opposition to those who seek to deny those same rights. And let me add that the reason I'm so focused this morning on the Children's March in Birmingham, Alabama, is because it is living proof that age doesn't matter, that people in their 20s and 30s and 40s can change history if they make an effort to do so, I think, and engage in the kind of discussions we have this morning. So thank you very much for that question.
Thank you, Rick. We've also had a lot of questions about the civil rights movement and Black Lives Matter movements today. And we were wondering if you feel that there's a difference in perspective on systemic racism between maybe some of the demonstrations back in the 60s and now, and do you think technology is a factor? Yeah, can you speak on that?
Okay, it's a big question. Thank you. yes, I think technology is critical. When I was a young lawyer, I defended a number of people each year, not my entire practice, who were wrongly convicted of crimes, issues of social justice. And it's those kinds of cases that show that without technology, it's extremely difficult to get people to believe, people on a jury, that the testimony being heard from an officer, a police officer, is not true. I remember one young man, his name was Leo Hernandez, and he was one of the first members of the Chicano brown shirt movement in Los Angeles. And he was accused of having assaulted and battered and beaten 2 police officers. Yet I found a woman in the community, a Black woman, coincidentally, who testified at the trial that he had been in front of her house collecting garbage, which was 1.5 miles away from the site where he had allegedly beaten these police officers. Nevertheless, because the police officers testified then that he had indeed committed those crimes, he had beaten them, he was convicted, and he spent 8 years in jail. At the time, he was 21 or 22 years of age. But today, with technology, with videotapes, with the kinds of videos that we've watched today, it becomes very difficult to deny what we actually see. The other part of the question, I think, dealing with demonstrations, I don't know the impact, the full impact of the Black Lives Matter movement demonstrations, but I feel in my heart that they are incredibly important. They show that people of all different backgrounds, of all races, all beliefs, have gone out in the street to demonstrate their horror and disgust with this kind of unequal treatment. And I think it is not just a flash in the pan, and hopefully will be something that we'll see more of in the future. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. Yeah, and I really appreciate your perspective as an attorney as well. And we have a question about American justice system. And so the question is, as an attorney, do you feel that the American justice system is compromised? If so, is this where efforts should be focused on?
Another big question. I think the justice system, I wouldn't use the word compromised, although I think it is. I would say that it requires a lot of work, and it doesn't start with a quick fix. These things don't happen in a matter of months with some quick solutions. What I really believe is that in order to begin to repair the justice system, to begin to repair the racism that we see in our country, I think we need to start a discussion. And I think one of the first questions has to be to each of ourselves: what racism do I bring? What part of that narrative of inequality of Black people or brown people or people that are different do I bring to that discussion that's in the back of my mind? I grew up in the United States. I grew up with a lot of those preconceptions. And it seems to me, as Brian Stevenson pointed out in one of the videos, that like South Africa, where they have reconciliation courts, where in Berlin, as he mentioned, you can't go 100 yards without seeing a statue or a memorial or a monument to people that were brutally ripped from their homes and sent to camps to be burned alive. I think that's the kind of discussion or discussions that we need to have. We need to own up to our own racism in order to move forward. So, I hate those times you get an answer from a professor, you say, what's the cause? And he says, well, everything, economics and politics and this and that. But it is true, they're complicated issues. But I think these kinds of discussions, maybe other discussions focused on those narratives of racial difference, we need to start with that. Thank you. I wish I could give a better answer to that. It's a great question. I just don't have the time to really address it adequately right now. Thank you.
That was a great response. Thank you, Rick. And I think I appreciate you mentioning a lot about like allyship and kind of putting yourself in positions that might like I guess acknowledging privilege as well. And so we have a few questions about that. And so having been involved for many years in the civil rights movement, do you have any advice or strategies for maintaining sustainable engagement, preventing burnout?
I'm not sure what's meant by burnout other than you march today, you march next week, you begin discussions, and then it seems like nothing happens. And that is our history. I mean, back in the 1960s during the civil rights movement, I never believed that we would be discussing and dealing with the same issues today until I read a wonderful historian from a long time ago, a man named Toynbee. And he had other theories, but the one that I like to focus on was his explanation that every generation, every new generation, every time we have people turning in their 20s and their 30s and their 40s, you have to re-argue and refight the same issues all over again. It's never over, and it's never easily achieved. You don't accomplish the kinds of systemic changes I think we're talking about by sitting down and having a discussion, but it's a place to begin. I don't know any other way to do that. So I think that's my answer. Thank you.
Thank you. And there were a few questions about, let's see, kind of like how to begin that conversation with people maybe that aren't as aware of privilege or of internalized biases. And so could you speak on maybe how to initiate that conversation with people that are not ready to hear that or are not aware of that?
Could you repeat that again? How to begin discussions? I didn't.
Yeah, so how to begin with discussions with people that maybe are resisting this type of dialogue or who aren't as aware of or accepting of the systemic nature of anti-Blackness and of inequities.
Yeah. One of the things I tried to do today in a very limited way because of the time was to talk about history. In the 60s, we used to have a thing called consciousness raising. And during the Vietnam War, we taught the history that no one really knew at the time of what had gone on in Indochina. Nobody had ever heard of it before. Nobody heard of the letters that Ho Chi Minh had written to the President of the United States asking for help to establish a democratic government. So I think one of the places we can begin is with what used to be called teach-ins. It's dry, but it's important. And I think it can give rise to interesting discussions. How to engage somebody directly who has not talked about or considered these issues. I don't have any magic answer, but I believe that if you speak from your heart, it's difficult for anybody to reject those kinds of feelings. We have to begin small discussions. It could be a discussion with 4 people. It could be a discussion just with your friends to talk about whether there's any issues of racist feelings inside each of us and to try to be honest about that And if there aren't, to discuss why there are, among others. I mean, it doesn't have to be a big group. It could just start with the person that you live with, or the person that you go to school with, or somebody down the street that you have coffee with in the morning. Maybe those are the best kinds of discussions. Thanks, Sydney.
Thank you, Rick. And there was a question about Asian American activism. And so during the civil rights movement in the 60s, were there any Asian American or Japanese American activists present?
Yeah. There was never lists made. As hard as it is to believe, I don't think there's a list of people involved. There was one Japanese Canadian who was involved with us in Freedom Summer. I didn't know him well, but like all of us, he made deep commitments. I also believe that along with other members of the clergy, there were Buddhists present in the march in Selma, as there were many others. But that's something that it's an interesting subject, but I don't have a list of names. The quick answer is yes. But I couldn't direct you to the names of those people right now.
Thank you, Rick. I'm curious, can you speak a little bit more on the interviews that you did for Japanese Americans who were in prison during World War II?
Sure. I worked as a young lawyer with a somewhat famous attorney at the time named Stanley Fleischman. Stanley argued more First Amendment cases in front of the US Supreme Court by the mid-1950s than any other lawyer had. He came to me one day. We'd been working together about 4 or 5 years on different cases. And he said, how would you like to start interviewing people about their incarceration during the Second World War, people of Japanese heritage? And I thought it was a great idea, so I did. And he set up a series of, we took depositions, statements that are transcribed. I think there were 70 or 80 statements taken. One of the strange peculiarities at the time, this was in the early 1980s, and I had not yet been introduced to Shin Buddhism. In fact, a number of those interviews took place in the back room of the West Los Angeles Buddhist Temple. But they also occurred in other places. We put together that information, and then, similar to the discussion I mentioned with John Lewis, except we made the decision, Stanley came to me and said, okay, we've got all this proof, and we've got this incredible lawyer whose name, I'm pretty sure it's Jeremy Irons, who was the real hero of the cases, of the 3 cases that overturned the convictions of Hirabayashi, Yasui, and Korematsu. He was a political science professor. He had gone to jail in the Second World War for being a conscientious objector. And he really led this entire movement in the 1970s until he could interest a group of lawyers in Seattle and Stanley and myself in Los Angeles to collect this evidence. We decided that the face of this case should be a Japanese American face. And so we made contact with lawyers in the Bay Area, eventually with Dale Manami. Other lawyers refused to take the case. And we sent all of the boxes of depositions to them, and they formed a legal team that appeared in the United States District Court. It was the lower courts that overturned those convictions. And so, like everything, it was kind of a community effort. I wasn't involved with the team that took the case to court, but I think rightfully it was a Japanese American face And I think that was overall, in an overall sense, helpful to winning those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you, Rick. We have a couple more questions, and just as a note to everybody, I know I have a lot more questions to ask. I'm sure people do too. So if we haven't gotten to your question, maybe we can have Rick do like a part 2 or something where he comes later and asks questions. I don't know. We could maybe discuss that later. But if you are curious about other things, please fill out the Google form. I think Brandon shared it in the chat. We'll also send it out as the survey following this. So if you have more questions or things that you're curious about, please let us know there. So we'll do a couple more. So Rick, we were wondering how you got introduced to the West LA Temple, and maybe how you got interested in Shin Buddhism.
When you look back on your own history, the stories you tell change. They do for me, because you get older and you have different views of it. But a friend of mine, a family that were members at the West LA Buddhist Temple, took me about 1983 or 84 to an Obon festival. And there were thousands of people. And in that group, there were a number of people who were dancers. I could mention all of their names, but they wouldn't mean a lot. Anyway, I became friends with them because I thought dancing in unison like that was the most exciting thing I'd ever seen. And for 25 years after that, I danced with this group all over Southern California. And after dancing for a couple of years, I thought to myself, why don't I find out what this stuff is really all about? Because I'm just kind of getting the benefits without contributing anything back. And so I met people early in those years. In particular, I met 2 people that were extremely welcoming. And I'm sure because they're Nisei, I will embarrass them. It's Sei Shohara and his wife, who has passed on, Yasuko Shohara. And in fact, it was at Yasuko's urgings that I read comments from a personal diary I kept during Freedom Summer to a couple of people in the church. I became more interested. I started to read about Shin Buddhism, and I met wonderful ministers like Reverend Greg Gibbs of Pasadena, Reverend Marvin Harada of Orange County, Reverend David Matsumoto, who at that time was a minister in Berkeley, and they really turned me on. They had a message that really appealed to me. I had long since abandoned my thoughts of being religious as a Jewish boy because I couldn't quite deal with the concept of a God. And so it was a natural following. And I have to say, although I've never said this before, it was the welcome and the friendliness and the companionship of all these wonderful people that invited this white Jewish kid to join them in their temple and learn about their culture. And it was the most extraordinary event in my life. And my belief in Shin Buddhism is one of the most important things I carry with me. So sorry to be so. Anyway, that's my answer.
Thank you, Rick. Okay, so we'll do our last question, and it's going to be a big one, so I'm just warning you. But we're wondering on a BCA level, a temple member, or on the BCA level, or as a temple member, or maybe just individual human level, what is the way forward? And what actions should we take? And is there maybe a call to action or any other kind of last, I guess, call to action that that you'd like to share at this time?
Well, it's an extraordinary time for BCA, and for those couple of dozen members joining us today, BCA is the Buddhist Churches of America. We have a bishop. I hate the word bishop. It's the religious and spiritual leader of all of our 59 temples and our sanghas in the United States, and his name is Reverend Marvin Harada. And we have a BCA president whose name is Kent Matsuda. They together have an open view of trying to reach out and appeal to all members of all backgrounds. And I think that is the way forward. As far as an active voice, it doesn't have to be sponsored by the Buddhist churches of America. It doesn't have to be a temple that goes along. There may be members of your temple that are not in agreement with our views about matters of social justice. But we can begin, and there are a significant minority, I think, of members that want to become involved, whose activities as a Buddhist really call out to them to try and be helpful to those that are less advantaged, people living in poverty and homelessness, African Americans that have suffered for so long. And so I don't think it's a worldwide or an organizational wide approach. It doesn't need to be. But I think we can begin gathering groups of like-minded people from all areas of BCA and from our communities of people that are different. Maybe our temples need to reach out to African American Baptist churches and see what they're doing and what we can do together, to Jewish synagogues, to Catholic churches, to Methodist churches, to anyone who will listen and want to discuss these issues. Because I think there is a burning desire to talk about these things, and there's a feeling that it needs to be guided in some way. And it's kind of like the March on Washington. I think we just need to do it. So, and we can. So, thank you, Sam. Thank you, Sydney.
Thank you, Rick. And with that, we'll end the Q&A portion. And I just want to thank you so much for this whole presentation. And this was very inspiring and very empowering. And so I really appreciate you sharing your experiences with us. I have a lot more questions and I want to read your memoir, so you should work on that. But I'm going to just do a few kind of logistical things, and then we'll do a closing gospel with Reverend Harada, and then after that, people maybe can give you a proper round of applause. But yeah, thank you so much. And I also want to thank Judy and Koichi for co-hosting this workshop, and Carl Yanari for helping with the Zoom management. And I also want to thank John Mullins for helping with the organization of this, and Carrie Kubota for designing the flyers. And if everyone who participated, if you could fill out the feedback form that Brandon has been putting in the chat, and also we'll email that out to everybody, that would be great. We'll also email a link to donate, so you can do that there. I don't know, and maybe Judy can put it in the chat as well. Yeah, so yeah, if you have any more questions or if you want more discussion, please let us know through the feedback form, or you could just email whoever, and hopefully the message will get across. So yeah, with that being said, can we have Reverend Bishop Harada lead us in another gospel?
Thank you, Rick, for such a wonderful talk this morning. And thank you everyone for attending. Nam Wami Double Two. Nam Wami Double Two. Nam Wami Double Two.